She stood there in her uniform, trembling in front of 200 millionaires when he ordered her to play the piano just to humiliate her. No one expected what happened next. Clara Martinez was on her knees on the marble floor of the main hall, wiping down the legs of the German grand piano when she heard Ricardo Del Monte's firm footsteps descending the curved staircase. 3 years of working in that mansion had taught her to identify her employer's every mood just by the sound of his shoes on the floor. Today, on the eve of the year's most important party, he walked with that nervous urgency that always surfaced when big business deals were at stake. She pretended not to notice when he stopped at the entrance of the hall, watching her work. Ricardo had a habit of standing still, analyzing as if he were appraising a property he wasn't sure was worth the investment. Clara continued cleaning, focused on doing the job perfectly as she always did. She couldn't afford to fail at anything. "Clara." His voice cut through the morning silence like a sharp blade, authoritarian, leaving no room for questions. She slowly stood up, wiping her hands on her apron before turning around. Ricardo stood in front of the enormous windows overlooking the estate's gardens, where event company staff were already setting up structures for the next evening's party. His hands were clasped behind his back, maintaining the rigid posture he always adopted when he wanted to assert authority. "Yes, Mr. Del Monte. Tomorrow night we'll have 200 guests here. The most influential men in the country will be in this room." He turned slowly, and Clara noticed something different in his gaze, a strange, almost cruel glint that she couldn't decipher. "These are important people, investors, businessmen, politicians, people who can make or break careers with a single word." Clara nodded, not understanding what he was leading to. In 3 years of working in the house, she had seen dozens of parties like this. She always stayed in the background, serving drinks, clearing plates, invisible like a shadow. That's how she liked it. Being invisible was safe. "I need to impress these people, show them that I'm not just a successful businessman, but a refined, cultured man." Ricardo began to walk in slow circles around her. "Someone who appreciates fine arts." Clara's stomach began to clench. She knew that tone, that way he spoke when he was planning something. 3 years had been enough to learn to read the signs. "Do you know how to play the piano?" It wasn't a question. It was a cold statement that sent a chill down Clara's veins. She hesitated for a fraction of a second. For 3 years, she had been extremely careful never to give any hint of her musical training. She never went near the piano when he was around. She never showed knowledge of classical music. She never let anything slip that could reveal her past. "A little Mr. Del Monte." The lie came out low, almost inaudible. Ricardo smiled, but it was a smile without warmth, without humanity. "Don't lie to me, Clara. I know exactly who you are. I know where you came from. I know what you lost." Clara's world seemed to tilt. She felt her legs grow weak, her heart race. How did he know? How could he know things she had never told anyone? "Tomorrow during dinner you will play for my guests." Ricardo stopped in front of her so close she could smell his expensive cologne. "You'll wear your maid's uniform, of course. I want everyone to see how good my taste is, even in choosing my staff." Clara opened her mouth to protest, but no sound came out. The words were stuck in her throat, mixed with years of silent humiliation. "There's no room for discussion." Ricardo raised his hand, cutting off any attempt at a response. "You will play Chopin Bach, something these people recognize and appreciate. And you will play well, Clara. Very well, because if you don't, you can look for another job Monday morning." The ultimatum hung in the air like a physical threat. Clara knew he wasn't bluffing. Ricardo Del Monte never bluffed, and she had nowhere to go. She had no family, not enough savings to start over somewhere else. She no longer had the connections she once had in the music world. "Understood, sir." "Excellent." Ricardo smiled again, but this time there was satisfaction in his expression. "And Clara, I want you to understand one thing very clearly. You are not an artist here. You are my maid, a maid who happens to know how to play the piano. Don't forget that for a second." He left the room, leaving Clara alone with the piano she cleaned every day but never touched. She approached the instrument and ran her fingers over the keys without pressing any. The piano was always perfectly tuned, cared for by a technician who came once a month, but no one ever played it. It was just an expensive decorative piece like everything else in that house. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Clara performed her duties on autopilot, cleaning, organizing, supervising the party preparations, but her mind was elsewhere, remembering a time when pianos were not obstacles to bypass during cleaning, but extensions of her own soul. She remembered the afternoons at the Royal Conservatory of London when her hands flew across the keys with the confidence of someone born for it. She remembered the applause of teachers who said she had a brilliant future ahead of her. She remembered her proud parents in the audience, her mother crying with emotion whenever she performed. And she remembered the accident, the phone call that changed everything. The hurried return to Brazil, the double funeral, the money that ran out, the dreams that died with them. At 6 p.m., Clara went up to her small room on the top floor of the mansion. It was a simple functional space with a single bed, a small wardrobe, and a window overlooking the back of the property. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the black and white uniform hanging in the closet. Tomorrow she would have to wear that uniform and humiliate herself in front of 200 people. She would have to play music she once loved as entertainment for bored millionaires. She would have to be Ricardo Del Monte's exotic spectacle. But maybe, just maybe, she could truly play again. Even if it was for a few minutes, even if it was under humiliating circumstances. Her hands had missed the keys for so long that even that seemed better than nothing. The next morning, the mansion buzzed with activity. Florists, waiters, sound technicians, decorators, everyone rushing back and forth, preparing for the evening's party. Clara helped with the supervision, checking every detail, ensuring everything was perfect. Ricardo appeared occasionally to give instructions, but he didn't mention the piano again. He didn't need to. The threat had already been made. At 4 p.m., Clara went up to get ready. She took a long shower, trying to relax her tense muscles. She combed her hair into a simple, discreet bun. She put on the black and white uniform she detested, but knew made her look exactly what Ricardo wanted a maid. When she came down to the hall at 7 p.m., the party was already starting. The first guests arrived in imported cars handed over to valets at the entrance. Men in tuxedos and women in evening gowns crossed the main hall towards the ballroom, where waiters offered champagne and gourmet appetizers. Clara stayed in the shadows as she always did during parties. She knew that routine by heart. Circulate discreetly among the guests, offer drinks, collect empty glasses, be useful without being noticed. But today was different. Today she knew that at some point she would be dragged into the spotlight. The guests were exactly the kind of people Ricardo wanted to impress. Powerful businessmen, international investors, influential politicians, people accustomed to getting everything they wanted when they wanted it, people who saw individuals like Clara as part of the decor. Clara observed the conversations, the calculated smiles, the handshakes that sealed multi-million-dollar deals. It was a world she knew from afar, a world where she had once moved as a guest artist, not a servant. Dinner was served at 9. 5 elaborate courses, expensive wines, conversations about investments, and business opportunities. Clara helped serve, maintaining a neutral face while listening to fragments of conversations about money, power, and influence. It was after dessert that Ricardo stood up and tapped a spoon against a crystal glass. The sound echoed through the hall, gradually silencing all conversations. "My dear friends," Ricardo began. His voice projected to reach every corner of the hall. "I hope you enjoyed dinner. Now I have a special surprise for you." Clara felt her stomach tighten. It was time. "One of my staff members will treat us to some classical music. As you know, I've always appreciated the fine arts, and I believe good music is essential for a perfect evening." Ricardo gestured towards Clara, and she felt 200 pairs of eyes turn to her simultaneously. The silence that followed was absolute, filled with curiosity and expectation. "Clara, come here." Clara's legs trembled as she began to walk between the tables. Each step seemed to echo like thunder in the silent hall. She heard whispers, low comments, stifled giggles. Some women exchanged disdainful glances. Some men made remarks about the entertainment Ricardo had prepared. "How interesting, Ricardo," said one of the guests, a middle-aged blonde woman with a pearl necklace that probably cost more than Clara's annual salary. "A maid who plays piano. How creative. Where did you find her?" Another guest asked, laughing, "At a music school for domestics." The comments continued, each more humiliating than the last. Clara kept her face impassive, but inside she felt shattered. Every word was like a stab at her dignity. She reached the piano and her hands trembled as she opened the lid. The instrument was magnificently tuned as always. It was an imported Steinway, a work of art worth more than most people earned in a lifetime. Clara sat on the cushioned bench and for a moment was paralyzed. Her hands hovered over the keys, visibly trembling. She could feel all eyes fixed on her. She could hear the contained giggles, the malicious whispers. Ricardo stood beside the piano, arms crossed, a satisfied smile on his face. He had gotten exactly what he wanted to turn her into the evening spectacle, the exotic curiosity to entertain his rich guests. "Any problem, dear?" one of the women asked, her tone laden with false concern. Stage fright, more laughter, more humiliation. Clara closed her eyes and took a deep breath. For a moment, she tried to transport herself to another place, another time. She remembered her father teaching her not to play only with her hands, but with her heart. She remembered her mother saying that true music comes from the soul, not from technique. When she opened her eyes, something had changed. Her hands stopped trembling. Her shoulders straightened. She positioned her fingers over the keys, and for an instant that seemed to last an eternity, the hall was completely silent. Then Clara began to play. The first notes of Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major flowed from the piano like drops of liquid crystal. Every sound perfectly articulated, every musical phrase constructed with a precision that made even the most skeptical stop whispering. It wasn't just the correct execution of the notes, it was something much deeper. It was Clara Martinez, the child prodigy, who studied at the Royal Conservatory of London, finally coming home. The sound that came from the piano was not what anyone expected. Conversations ceased one by one like candles being extinguished by the wind. First, it was the closest table where a group of businessmen paused in the middle of a discussion about oil investments. Then the back table where the millionaires' wives interrupted comments about each other's dresses. In a matter of seconds, 200 people were in absolute silence, hypnotized by the music flowing from the hands of a housemaid. Clara was no longer in the Del Monte Mansion's hall. She was back at the Royal Conservatory of London at 19, when the whole world seemed possible and music was her native language. Her fingers danced across the keys with an ease that made it seem as though the piano was an extension of her own body. Each note carried years of study, sacrifice, and love for an art she had been forced to abandon. Ricardo, who stood by the piano with a smug smile on his face, began to feel a growing unease. This was not going as he had planned. The idea was for Clara to play a simple tune, something that would elicit a few condescending compliments from the guests and show how refined he was for having a talented maid. But what was happening was completely different. Margaret Sinclair, a music critic for the city's most influential newspaper, slowly rose from her table and began to walk toward the piano. She was a 70-year-old woman with gray hair pulled back in an elegant bun who had watched the world's best pianists over 5 decades of her career, and what she was hearing left her speechless. Other guests did the same, drawn by a magnetic force they couldn't explain. A circle formed around Clara, people approaching as if they were witnessing something sacred. The sound of heels on the marble stopped completely. Even the waiters had put down their trays to listen. Clara transitioned from the Nocturne to Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor without even noticing the change. Her muscle memory had taken over, and she was playing pieces she had known by heart since she was 15. But it wasn't just technical execution. She was telling a story with each chord, each pause, each crescendo. It was the story of her own loss, her fall, her silent resilience during 3 years of humiliation. "My God," one of the women whispered, her eyes welling up. She was holding a champagne glass she no longer remembered having in her hand. "She's extraordinary." Thomas Crawford, one of the country's most powerful investors, known for his coldness in business and for never showing emotion in public, had tears streaming down his face. He had no idea why he was crying. He only knew that the music was stirring something very deep within him, something he had forgotten existed since childhood. Ricardo felt cold sweat begin to trickle down his forehead. He looked around and saw something he had never seen before at these parties: genuine emotion. People who spent their entire lives buying and selling, accumulating wealth and power, stood there like children, completely absorbed by Clara's music. The Minister of Finance's wife, a woman known for her arrogance and social coolness, moved closer to the piano, her eyes fixed on Clara's hands. She herself had studied piano as a child, before life led her to other paths, and she recognized mastery when she saw it. "Where did she learn to play like that?" she whispered to her husband. But he was so absorbed in the music that he didn't even hear the question. Clara finished the ballade and without pause began to play something different. It wasn't Chopin, nor Bach, nor any of the classics Ricardo had mentioned. It was her own composition, something she had written years ago but never had the courage to play for anyone. It was a piece about loss and rebirth, about finding beauty in pain, about maintaining dignity, even when the whole world seemed to conspire against you. The music rose and fell like ocean waves, sometimes soft as a caress, sometimes intense as a storm. Clara had closed her eyes again and was completely lost in her own creation. Her hands moved with a fluidity that mesmerized those who watched. Every movement precise yet full of passion. "Stop!" Ricardo's voice cut through the air like a whip, but no one moved, not even Clara. She continued playing as if she hadn't heard anything, lost in her own music. "I said stop!" Ricardo shouted louder, his face red with anger and embarrassment. Some people turned to look at him with clear disapproval, as if he had just committed a blasphemy. Margaret Sinclair approached Ricardo, her eyes shining with an intensity he had never seen in a 70-year-old woman. She had a formidable reputation in the music world, known for destroying careers with a negative review or elevating unknown artists to stardom with a single write-up. "You don't interrupt such talent, young man." Her voice was low but firm, imbued with decades of authority in the classical music world. "This young lady is a genius. Where did you find her?" Ricardo opened and closed his mouth like a fish out of water. He didn't know what to answer because the truth was too complicated to explain at that moment, and any lie would sound ridiculous given Clara's obvious talent. "She works for me," was all he managed to say. "Works as what?" Margaret asked, but before Ricardo could answer, she shook her head. "It doesn't matter. What matters is that she needs to be on a stage, not in a private house." Clara reached the climax of her composition, her hands flying across the keys with a passion that made even the waiters stop serving to listen. The music grew in intensity, each chord more powerful than the last, building to a finale that promised to be emotionally devastating. Dr. Fernando Oliveira, one of the country's most respected cardiologists, found himself thinking of his daughter, who had died young, and how much she loved music. His wife beside him wept openly, remembering the same lost child. They hadn't spoken about their daughter for years. The pain was too great, but somehow Clara's music was bringing back not just the sadness, but also the happy memories. A young tech entrepreneur known for his extreme rationality and for making all decisions based on data was completely surprised to find himself emotional. He was used to analyzing everything coldly, but he couldn't rationally explain why that music affected him so much. When Clara played the last note of her composition, the silence that followed was even deeper than before. It was the kind of silence that only happens after something transcendent, when people need a moment to return to reality to process what they have just experienced. Then someone started to clap. It was Margaret Sinclair clapping slowly, but with an intensity that made everyone else follow suit. In seconds, the entire hall erupted in applause. These were not polite social event claps. They were genuine emotional applause, the kind of ovation given to true artists. Clara finally looked up from the piano, and it was as if she were waking from a dream. She saw all those people applauding her, saw tears on faces, saw admiration where there had once been contempt. And when her eyes met Ricardo's, she saw something she had never seen before: pure fear. He had completely lost control of the situation. What should have been a small, orchestrated humiliation had turned into something much larger. Clara was no longer the shy maid he could manipulate at will. In that moment, she was an artist, and everyone in the room knew it. Margaret Sinclair was the first to approach Clara, who was still sitting on the piano bench, stunned by what had just happened. The music critic had tears in her eyes, something very few people had seen over her career. "Darling, I need to speak with you urgently. What you just did, that's not common talent. Where did you study, with whom? How is it possible that you are working here?" She paused, realizing the delicacy of the situation. Clara looked at Ricardo, seeking permission to answer, but he was pale, clearly in shock at the turn of events. She decided to speak for herself for the first time in 3 years. "Royal Conservatory of London, ma'am." A murmur swept through the crowd like a wave. The Royal Conservatory was one of the world's most prestigious musical institutions. It was no place for amateurs or dilettantes. It was where the best musicians on the planet perfected their art. "And why are you working?" Margaret paused again, but this time she was interrupted by other guests approaching. "It's a long story," Clara replied softly, but her voice was heard by several people. Thomas Crawford, still with red eyes from emotion, approached and extended his hand to Clara. "Miss, what you just did was the most beautiful thing I've ever heard in my life, and I've heard Yo-Yo Ma play live." Ricardo finally regained his voice, but when he spoke it came out as a desperate shout. "Enough! The performance is over. Everyone back to your tables." But no one moved. On the contrary, more people approached Clara, wanting to congratulate her, wanting to know more about her. The circle around the piano grew with each passing second, and Ricardo realized he had made the biggest mistake of his life. Instead of humiliating Clara, he had given her a platform to show the world who she truly was. And now there was no turning back. Her music had touched hearts that hadn't been moved in decades. It had awakened something in people who lived mechanical lives focused only on profit and status. And Ricardo Del Monte, who only wanted to impress his guests with a display of power over a talented maid, had just discovered he had unleashed a genius. The party continued, but the atmosphere had completely changed. The guests couldn't stop talking about Clara. Small groups formed in corners of the hall, and she was the only topic. Conversations about business and investments had been completely forgotten. Everyone wanted to know more about the maid who played like an angel. Margaret Sinclair had managed to get a few minutes alone with Clara in a more secluded corner of the hall and was asking direct questions that made the young woman increasingly uncomfortable. The music critic had taken a small notebook from her purse and was taking notes as they spoke. "How old were you when you entered the conservatory?" Margaret asked, holding a glass of wine she hadn't even touched. 15. I won a full scholarship." Clara spoke softly, always keeping an eye on Ricardo, who circulated through the hall, desperately trying to regain the guests' attention for other topics. "And when did you leave?" "At 21. I didn't finish the course." Margaret frowned, clearly surprised. "Why, with such talent you should be playing on the best stages in Europe. You should have an international career." Clara averted her gaze, observing the guests who still approached the piano, touching the keys with reverence, as if the instrument had become sacred after her performance. "Some things happened in my family. I had to return to Brazil. I ended up without resources to continue my studies." It wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the whole story either. The truth was much more painful and complicated than she had the courage to tell a stranger, even if that stranger was one of the country's most respected music critics. On the other side of the hall, Ricardo was having an increasingly tense conversation with some of his main investors. They wanted to know why he had never mentioned that he had an international-level pianist working in his house as a domestic maid. And the questions were becoming increasingly direct and embarrassing. "It's a little strange, don't you think, Ricardo?" said Thomas Crawford, owner of one of the city's largest construction companies, the same man who had cried during Clara's performance. "The young lady clearly has a superior education from one of the best music schools in the world. How did she end up cleaning your house?" Ricardo forced a smile, but he was clearly nervous. "She needed work. I needed a trustworthy employee. It was a mutually beneficial situation." "But did you know about her talent? insisted another investor, a younger man who ran an international investment fund. Ricardo hesitated for a second too long before answering. I suspected she knew how to play. The answer convinced no one. The men exchanged glances Ricardo knew well from years of business. They were looks of distrust, of questioning. In the corporate world, when people started questioning your integrity and your motivations, things could go downhill very quickly. Suspecting is one thing, Crawford said, crossing his arms. But what we just saw is not amateur work. That young lady has the technique of an international concert pianist, and you keep her as a domestic maid. Meanwhile, Clara was being introduced to more people than she could memorize. Businessmen, doctors, lawyers, diplomats. Everyone wanted to congratulate her. Everyone wanted to know more about her story. She felt exposed, vulnerable, as if standing in the middle of a stage, not knowing what role she should play. Dr. Roberto Mendez, a music producer who had worked with some of the country's most famous artists, approached Clara with eyes gleaming with professional interest. Clara, you need to return to playing professionally, he said without mincing words. I can introduce you to some important people, record labels, concert promoters, symphony orchestra conductors. I don't know if that would be possible, Clara replied, looking nervously in Ricardo's direction. Why wouldn't it be possible? You're free, aren't you? You're not tied to any exclusive employment contract. Clara didn't know how to explain that her situation was much more complicated than it seemed, that she had no money to leave her job, nowhere to live, no longer the confidence she once had in her own talent. 3 years of daily humiliation had left deep marks on her self-esteem. The Minister of Finance's wife, still moved by the performance, joined the conversation. Darling, what you just did there was pure art. I studied piano for 10 years when I was young, and I never ever managed to play with a tenth of your sensitivity. It was just beautiful, another woman added. It's been years since music moved me so much. You reminded me why I used to love classical concerts. People kept approaching, forming a small crowd around Clara. She heard compliments, questions, offers of help, but everything seemed too surreal to be true. For 3 years, she had been treated as invisible, as someone without value, and now suddenly she was the center of attention for some of the country's most influential people. Margaret Sinclair observed everything with professional interest. As an experienced music critic, she knew how to recognize not only technical talent, but also the story behind an artist. And there was something in the way Clara played an emotional depth that only came from someone who had suffered greatly. Clara, Margaret said, interrupting the other conversations, you mentioned that you didn't finish your course at the conservatory. May I ask what happened? Clara hesitated, looking around the circle of expectant faces. These were people she didn't know, who minutes before had seemed like part of the furniture, but who now hung on her every word. My parents died, she said simply, in a car accident. I had to return to Brazil to deal with legal matters and ended up without resources to continue my studies. A respectful silence fell upon the group. Several people lowered their eyes, clearly moved by the revelation. And since then you've been working here, asked Dr. Mendez. For 3 years. 3 years without playing professionally? Margaret's voice carried barely contained indignation. That's a crime against art. On the other side of the hall, Ricardo was completely losing control of the situation. More people approached him with questions about Clara, and he had no satisfactory answers. Worse still, some people were starting to look at him with evident disapproval. The wife of one of the senators present approached him with a severe expression. Ricardo, I hope you are paying this young lady adequately. Her talent is worth much more than a maid's salary. Of course, Ricardo replied quickly, but the lie was obvious to everyone. The party continued until almost midnight, but Margaret Sinclair was one of the last to leave. Before going, she approached Clara, who was helping to collect empty glasses, automatically returning to her role as a maid. Stop that, Margaret said, taking the tray from Clara's hands. You are not a maid, not after what I saw tonight. She took a business card from her purse and handed it to Clara. Call me tomorrow. I need to write an article about you, and I have some contacts that might be very interesting. Margaret looked directly into Clara's eyes with the intensity of someone accustomed to discovering great talents. Whatever happened in your life that made you stop playing it cannot continue like this. You have a gift that cannot be wasted. It's almost a moral obligation to the world. When the last guest left, Ricardo locked the front door and turned to Clara. The expression on his face was one of contained fury she had never seen before. It was the fury of a man who had lost control of a situation he himself had created. "To my office, now!" Clara climbed the stairs behind him, her heart pounding. She knew she was in trouble, but she couldn't regret what she had done. Playing again, even for just a few minutes, had awakened something within her that had been dormant for years. It had been like breathing after being underwater for a long time. Ricardo closed the office door forcefully and positioned himself behind the solid mahogany desk, his hands resting on the polished surface. He was clearly struggling to control his anger, and Clara could see a vein pulsing in his temple. "You embarrassed me tonight, Mr. Del Monte." "I just did what you asked, sir. I played the piano for your guests." "Don't give me that." Ricardo began to pace back and forth behind the desk. "You know very well that's not what I wanted. I wanted you to play a simple tune, elicit some polite compliments, and that's it. I didn't want you to become the center of attention." Clara remained silent, her hands clasped in front of her body. She knew anything she said would only make the situation worse. "And now everyone will go around saying that I have a world-class pianist working as a cleaning lady in my house. They'll think I'm some kind of exploiter, that I take advantage of vulnerable people." "But isn't that what you do, sir?" The question slipped from Clara's mouth before she could stop herself. Ricardo stopped pacing and stared at her with an expression of shock and fury. "What did you say?" Clara took a deep breath. She had come this far. She wasn't going to back down now. 3 years of silent humiliation had forged a courage she didn't know she possessed. "You hired me knowing I had musical training. You pay me less than you would any other domestic maid with my experience. You treat me as if I'm inferior, as if I'm your property, and today you used me as entertainment to impress your friends. If that's not exploitation, I don't know what is." The silence that followed was tense like a piano string about to snap. Ricardo was clearly struggling to control his rage, and Clara was wondering if she hadn't just signed her own dismissal. "You are being ungrateful," Ricardo finally said, his voice low and dangerous. "I gave you a job when no one else would. I gave you a roof, food, stability, and as soon as you have an opportunity, you stab me in the back. I never wanted to stab anyone in the back. I just wanted to play the piano. And now you'll be able to play as much as you want because you're fired." Even expecting this possibility, hearing the words was like being punched in the stomach. Clara felt her world collapse again, exactly as it had 3 years ago when everything fell apart. "You have until Monday to find somewhere else to stay, and don't even think about using my name as a reference." Clara felt unable to speak. She turned to leave the office but stopped when she heard Ricardo's voice once more. "Clara." She turned. "You may have talent, but talent doesn't pay the bills. You'll find that out the hard way." She left the office and went up to her room, her legs trembling. She sat on the small, narrow bed and looked at her own hands, the same hands that just a few hours earlier had brought tears to 200 people, now trembled with fear and uncertainty. But for the first time in 3 years, Clara didn't feel completely lost. Margaret Sinclair was right. She had a gift, and perhaps it was time to stop being afraid to use it, even if that meant facing an uncertain future. Margaret's card was on the bedside table. Clara picked it up and read the name printed on it. Margaret Sinclair, music critic, National Arts Journal. Tomorrow she would call. Tomorrow she would take the first step to reclaim the life she had lost 3 years ago. 6 months later, Clara was backstage at the Municipal Theater adjusting the black concert gown Margaret Sinclair had insisted on buying for her. Her hands no longer trembled. After 24 weeks of intensive rehearsals with the municipal orchestra, auditions in other cities, and performances at smaller events, she felt at home again in the world of music. 10 minutes to curtain, announced Sophia, one of the theater technicians, who had become Clara's friend during the preparations. Clara took a deep breath and looked in the dressing room mirror. The woman who looked back at her was completely different from the one who cleaned the Del Monte mansion. There was light in her eyes, confidence in her posture, purpose in every movement. But more than that, there was peace. A peace she hadn't felt since before her parents' death. The last 6 months had been an emotional roller coaster. After accepting the audition at the Municipal Orchestra and securing the position as first pianist, other opportunities began to appear like falling dominoes. Invitations to play at classical music festivals, recording proposals, offers to perform in other cities. Margaret Sinclair had kept her word. The article she wrote about Clara, titled "The Hidden Genius: How a Housemaid Revealed Herself as the Greatest Pianist of Her Generation," had been republished in newspapers across the country. Clara's phone hadn't stopped ringing. A soft knock at the door broke her thoughts. It was Margaret, elegant in a navy blue dress, holding a bouquet of white roses. "How are you feeling?" she asked, handing over the flowers. "Ready," Clara replied, and she truly felt that way. "More ready than I've ever felt," Margaret said with a smile. "Critics from 5 different newspapers. The Minister of Culture is here, and he has some surprises for you." "What surprises?" Margaret smiled mysteriously. "You'll see, but I can tell you one thing: your Aunt Helena arrived from Sao Paulo this morning." Clara felt her eyes fill with tears. Helena was her mother's sister, the only family she had left. They had lost touch after the tragedy when Clara was so lost in her own grief that she had pushed away everyone who could remind her of what she had lost. "How did you—" "I looked for her. I thought you needed family here today, and she was dying to see you again." They walked together down the corridors to the wings. Clara could hear the murmur of the audience on the other side of the curtain. She could feel the electric energy that always preceded a major concert. But this time it was different. This time she wasn't playing because someone forced her to, or because she needed to impress anyone. She was playing because it was what she was born to do. Maestro Roberto approached already dressed in his full dress coat. Over the past few months, he had become more than a musical director to Clara. He was a mentor, almost a father figure. He saw in her not only technical talent, but an emotional maturity that few artists achieve so young. "Clara, are you ready to make history?" he asked, adjusting his bow tie. She nodded. During rehearsals, Roberto had been impressed not only with her technique, but with her ability to interpret and convey emotion through music. He said she had something rare, the ability to make every person in the audience feel that the music was being played specifically for them. "Today you are not just Clara Martinez, the pianist," he said, placing a hand on her shoulder. "You are Clara Martinez, the survivor, the woman who lost everything and rebuilt her life through music. That's what makes your art so special." "Ladies and gentlemen," the announcer's voice echoed through the theater, "please welcome the Municipal Orchestra and our guest soloist, Clara Martinez, performing Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2 in C minor, followed by an original composition by the artist herself." Clara walked across the stage towards the piano, the spotlights creating a golden path in front of her. When she turned to greet the audience, her heart filled with emotion. In the first row next to Margaret Sinclair was Helena. Her aunt had aged in recent years, but her smile was the same as Clara's childhood. Helena was crying even before the music began. Her hands covering her face, clearly moved to see her niece back on stage. In the following rows, Clara recognized some faces from the party at the Del Monte mansion. Thomas Crawford was there with his wife. Dr. Mendez, the music producer, had come with a retinue of music industry executives. Several people who had been moved by her improvised performance on that fateful night had made sure to attend her official concert. But it was in the 5th row that Clara had the biggest surprise. Ricardo Del Monte was sitting alone, wearing a dark suit, his face serious but not hostile. He avoided her gaze when their eyes met, but the fact that he was there said a lot. Clara sat at the piano and positioned her hands on the keys. For a moment she closed her eyes and connected with the memory of her parents. She could almost hear her mother's voice whispering words of encouragement. She could almost feel her father's presence beside the piano, as in the old days. When she started to play, it was as if all the past years of pain, humiliation, and loss transformed into music. Rachmaninoff's concerto, one of the most challenging pieces in the classical repertoire, flowed from her hands as if it were the most natural thing in the world. But this time, it was different from all the other times she had played the piece. This time, she wasn't just executing the notes, she was telling her story through music. The first movement carried all the anguish of losing her parents. The more melancholic second movement spoke of the loneliness of the past few years, the struggle to survive. And the third movement was pure celebration, pure joy of having found her way back home. The orchestra accompanied her perfectly, Roberto conducting with a passion that infected all the musicians. Clara wasn't just playing with them. She was conversing, creating a musical dialogue that made every person in the audience feel part of something larger. During the second movement, Clara looked at the audience and saw tears on dozens of faces. She saw Helena crying openly. She saw Margaret Sinclair with her eyes closed, completely absorbed in the music, and she saw Ricardo, who was looking at her with an expression she had never seen before, genuine respect. The third movement demanded everything from her physically and emotionally. Her hands flew across the keys in technical passages that few pianists in the world could execute perfectly. But Clara wasn't just performing. She was living every note, every chord, every silence. When she played the last note of Rachmaninoff's concerto, the theater erupted in applause even before the traditional silence. It was a spontaneous, emotional standing ovation, the kind of reaction that happens when the audience witnesses something truly special. But Clara knew the night wasn't over yet. After a 15-minute intermission, she would return to the stage to play her original composition, the piece born of pain and transformed into hope, the music that told her entire journey from tragedy to redemption. During the intermission, Clara was congratulated by dozens of people backstage. Music critics were already writing enthusiastic reviews on their phones. Other orchestra musicians wanted to collaborate with her on future projects, and impresarios offered tempting contracts. Helena was one of the first to find her backstage, and their embrace lasted several minutes. Neither of them could speak. They just cried with emotion and relief. "Your mother and father would be so proud," Helena finally whispered in Clara's ear. "You honored their memory tonight in a way that goes beyond music." "Thank you for being here," Clara replied. "Having you in the audience made all the difference." Margaret approached with a smile that stretched from ear to ear. "Clara, you just gave the concert of the decade. I already have 3 record labels wanting to speak with you before the end of the week." But Clara was thinking of something else. "Margaret, did you see who's in the audience?" "Of course. Half the classical music world came to watch you play." "No, I mean Ricardo. He's here." Margaret frowned. "Interesting. After what happened, I didn't expect him to have the courage to show up. I want to talk to him after the concert." "Are you sure? After everything he did?" "I'm sure. He's part of my story, and tonight is about closure, about peace." The signal for the second half sounded, and Clara prepared to return to the stage. The second part of the concert would be dedicated entirely to her original composition, a 20-minute piece she had titled Rebirth. It was the music she had started writing in the Del Monte mansion in stolen moments when Ricardo wasn't around. It was the music she had played on that fateful night when her life changed forever. But now it was complete, matured, transformed by the experience of rebuilding her life from scratch. When she returned to the stage, the silence was absolute. Everyone knew they were about to hear something unique, something that had never been played publicly before. Clara sat at the piano and looked once more at the audience. This time when her eyes met Ricardo's, he didn't look away. There was something different in his expression, something she was beginning to recognize as regret. Clara placed her hands on the keys and began to play her own story. The composition Rebirth began softly like a whisper, sparse notes that seemed like raindrops falling on a silent lake. Clara had divided the piece into 4 movements that told her journey: loss, exile, awakening, and freedom. Each movement was a window into her soul, a musical confession that exposed her deepest wounds and her most precious healing. The first movement, Loss, was devastatingly beautiful. Clara relived through the music the moment she learned of her parents' death. The sensation of having the ground pulled out from under her feet, the absolute loneliness of losing everything that matters at once. There wasn't a single person in the audience who wasn't touched by that universal pain that human experience everyone fears living. Helena cried silently, remembering the sister she had lost and the niece she almost lost to sorrow as well. Thomas Crawford held his wife's hand tightly, thinking of his own children and what it would be like to lose loved ones. Even the orchestra musicians, who were only accompanying with soft instruments, had tears in their eyes. The second movement, Exile, was darker, heavier. It spoke of lost years, abandoned dreams, the slow death of hope. Clara played with a contained intensity that made the entire theater hold its breath. It was music of survival, about doing what needs to be done, even when the soul is dead. Ricardo in the fifth row found himself thinking not only of Clara's journey, but of his own, of the musical dreams he had abandoned due to family pressure, of the life he had built based on what others expected of him, not what his heart desired. It was during this movement that he realized something he had never admitted to himself. He had hired Clara not only because he knew her talent, but because she represented everything he wished he could have been. And instead of celebrating that connection, he had tried to destroy it out of envy and frustration. The third movement, Awakening, began with a single sustained note that gradually transformed into more complex chords. It was the moment of the party at the mansion the night Clara played again after years of silence. But in Clara's musical version, it wasn't about humiliation. It was about rediscovery, about music finding its voice again. The audience recognized some themes she had played that fateful night, but now they were integrated into a larger, more mature narrative. It was like hearing the same story told by someone who finally understood its real meaning. Margaret Sinclair made mental notes for her next review, but found herself simply absorbed by the experience. In 40 years of music criticism, she had rarely heard a composition that was both so personal and so universal. Clara wasn't just playing her story. She was playing the story of everyone who has ever had to start over after losing everything. The fourth and final movement, Freedom, was pure celebration. Not the easy celebration of someone who has never suffered, but the profound joy of someone who has found their way back home. Clara's hands danced across the keys with a lightness that contrasted dramatically with the intensity of the previous movements. It was music about second chances, about forgiveness, about the human capacity to transform pain into beauty. The main theme grew and developed, gaining layers of complexity and emotion until it culminated in an ending that made the entire theater vibrate. When Clara played the last note, the silence that followed was almost sacred. For a few seconds that seemed eternal, no one moved, no one breathed. It was as if everyone needed a moment to return to reality after a spiritual journey. Then the theater exploded. The ovation was unlike anything Clara had ever experienced. It wasn't just applause, it was shouts of "Bravo!" people on their feet, clapping with tears streaming down their faces. A collective catharsis that transformed the municipal theater into a temple of pure emotion. Clara rose from the piano and bowed deeply. When she straightened up, she looked for familiar faces in the audience. Helena was radiant, applauding with an expression of pride that warmed Clara's heart. Margaret smiled like a proud mother. And Ricardo was applauding too, but there was something different in his expression, the purest form of genuine respect. The ovation continued for more than 10 minutes. Clara had to return to the stage 3 times to thank them, and even then the audience didn't want to let her go. Finally, Roberto signaled for her to approach the microphone. "Thank you," Clara said, her voice choked with emotion. "Tonight represents much more than a concert for me. It represents the possibility of starting over, of transforming pain into something beautiful, of finding hope even in the darkest moments." She paused, looking directly at Ricardo. "I want to thank everyone who has been part of this journey, even those who challenged me in ways I didn't expect, because it was through challenges that I discovered my true strength." After the concert, backstage, Clara was greeted by a crowd of people. Critics spoke of a star being born. Producers offered multi-million-dollar contracts. Other musicians wanted to collaborate with her. But Clara was looking for one specific person. She found Ricardo outside the theater, leaning against his car, clearly waiting for her. When she approached, he straightened up nervously. "Clara," he said simply. "Ricardo." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of the past few months hanging between them. "You came," Clara finally said. "I had to come. I needed to hear you play for real, not as my maid, but as the artist you always were." Ricardo took a deep breath before continuing. "Clara, I came here to apologize not just for the words I said on the night of the party, but for all the time you worked for me. I knew who you were from day one, and I used that against you." Clara observed him, seeing the sincerity in his expression. "Why, Ricardo? Why did you do that?" "Because I was envious of your talent, your courage, the life you had lived. I always wanted to be a musician, always dreamed of playing piano like you do, but I never had the courage to follow my dreams." He paused, struggling to find the right words. "When I hired you, I thought it would be a way to keep music close to me, but instead of celebrating your talent, I tried to control it, to possess it. It was small and cruel of me." Clara felt a wave of emotion, but it wasn't anger. It was something closer to compassion. "Ricardo, you can still learn piano. You can still follow your dreams." He laughed, but it was a sad laugh. "I'm 43. Clara, it's too late. My parents always said that music has no age, only soul. If you truly want it, it's never too late." Ricardo looked at her with an expression of cautious hope. "Would you give me lessons?" Clara smiled. "We'll see. First, you need to buy a real piano, not just a decorative piece." "I already bought one," he said quickly. "Last week, a Yamaha." Clara chuckled. "Surprise. You've been planning this for a while." "Since the night of the party, since I realized I had wasted my entire life doing what others expected of me." Margaret Sinclair approached, interrupting their conversation. "Clara, I'm sorry to interrupt, but there are 3 journalists wanting to interview you and a producer from London who flew especially to see you play." Clara looked at Ricardo. "I have to go, but Ricardo, call me next week. We'll talk about those lessons." Ricardo smiled, and for the first time since Clara had known him, it was a genuine smile. "Thank you, Clara, for everything." 6 months later, Clara was giving her 5th concert as a soloist with the Municipal Orchestra. Her career had taken off in a way she never imagined possible. She had played at international festivals, recorded an album that was among the best-selling classical music, and received offers to play in the finest concert halls in Europe. But what made her happiest were the Tuesday and Thursday afternoons at Ricardo's mansion teaching him piano. He had proven to be a dedicated and surprisingly talented student. He would never be a virtuoso, but he played with a genuine emotion that compensated for any technical limitations. "You're improving so much," Clara said after a particularly good lesson. "Maybe next year you can play with me at a charity concert." Ricardo laughed. "I think that might be a bit too ambitious." "Never underestimate the power of music to transform lives," Clara responded. "Look what happened to us." They were sitting in the hall where everything had begun, but now the piano was no longer just a decorative piece. It was a living instrument used daily, loved and respected. "Clara," Ricardo said, suddenly serious, "there's one thing I never told you about that night about the party." "What is it?" "When you started playing, when I realized I had lost control of the situation for the first time in my life, I felt proud of something I had done because it was through my stupidity that the world discovered your talent." Clara smiled. "Ricardo, if you hadn't done what you did, I would still be hidden, wasting my talent out of fear. Sometimes the worst things that happen to us are what push us to where we're supposed to be." Ricardo moved to the piano and began to play a simple tune, one of the first Clara had taught him. It was Debussy's Clair de Lune, but he played it with such tenderness that even this well-known piece sounded special. Clara joined him on the piano bench and began to play an improvised accompaniment. There, in that moment, they were no longer former employer and former maid. They were no longer the millionaire and the rising artist. They were just two people who had found in music a way to heal old wounds and build a true friendship. Outside the mansion, the sun set over the city, painting the sky with the same colors Clara felt in her heart. Golden, like hope; pink, like gratitude; purple, like the peace of someone who had finally found their place in the world. The music continued to echo through the house, a melody of redemption and new beginnings, a symphony of two lives that had learned that it's never too late to become who they truly were, and that sometimes what seems like the end is just the beginning of something much more beautiful. End of story.